Let's summarize. We define the new Negro, in the words of historian Henry Louis Gates, as, quote, a new racial self, the public Negro self after 1895, unquote, that contrasted the new Negro's rising racial consciousness and self-assurance with the stereotyped servility and docility of the old Negro who had emerged from enslavement. New Negroes demanded that their rights be enshrined in law. We then examined the contrasting approaches to citizenship of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington's approach was the more conservative. He offered to accept segregation in exchange for whites not making discrimination worse, to give blacks time to become economically and socially uplifted. He believed that rising tides of prosperity and respectability would lift black claims to equality by whites. Du Bois believed blacks had nothing to prove, that the United States founding documents provided rights to all. He did not eschew economic uplift, but wanted to pressure the white establishment to live up to the American promise. Where Washington established Tuskegee Institute to train black students to prosper in manual labor, Du Bois sought to educate the so-called talented 10th as professionals and community leaders. After that, we examined how African American communities resisted Jim Crow. First, we looked at streetcar boycotts that followed segregationist city ordinances and state statutes between 1900 and 1907 in more than 25 southern cities. Though none of those succeeded in reversing segregation, they did show that black communities did not merely succumb to Jim Crow. We looked at two national organizations that arose because of Jim Crow: the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and Marcus Garvey's slightly later United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. The NAACP was integrationist and used legal tools and publicity to fight Jim Crow. Beginning in 1909, it grew to 300 chapters by 1919. Its journal, The Crisis, was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois and pointed out instance after instance of discrimination around the nation. It protested depictions of blacks as disreputable, as in W.D. Griffith's Birth of a Nation film, and fought for federal anti-lynching law. The NAACP was in the lead of most of the post-World War II lawsuits that finally cracked Jim Crow, particularly the 1954 Brown versus Board decision that ended the doctrine of separate but equal facilities. For his part, the Jamaican immigrant Marcus Garvey came to the U.S. in 1916 and soon opened a New York chapter of his UNIA, spreading across the U.S., the Caribbean, and into West Africa. He was a black separatist, which put him at serious odds with Du Bois, and he supported Pan-Africanism, which Du Bois later supported. This was the so-called Black to Africa movement. He wanted to complete separation of the races, leading him to an affinity with the Ku Klux Klan. But in his defense, he thought blacks could fare better in their own communities and with their own businesses than they could by being constantly pushed down by whites. The UNIA established a number of businesses, including the Negro World newspaper and the Black Star steamship line. But Garvey was imprisoned in the mid-1920s on conviction for mail fraud relative to a Black Star Line ship. He was deported and ultimately died in England in 1940. His wife continued to operate the UNIA for many years. Another form of resistance to Jim Crow was black economic prosperity, as Booker T. Washington advocated. In many cities, black residents established thriving business and residential areas like Parrish Street in Durham, North Carolina, Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, and most particularly Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. These were called Black Wall Streets after Booker T. Washington dubbed Greenwood the Negro Wall Street before 1915. Finally, we looked at the great migration of Southerners in search of jobs and freedom as war industries opened in the North and West. More whites migrated in the two big waves across the 20th century, but a higher percentage of blacks relative to their Southern population migrated, which led observers to consider the Great Migration to be a black phenomenon. Migrants were pushed by poor conditions in the South and pulled by the promise of good work and more freedom in the North and West, which largely panned out, though those cities and states intensified their own versions of discrimination. We looked at rural migration into southern cities too, using Houston as our lens. Because of segregation, blacks in cities congregated in neighborhoods. This was common with all other immigrants as well, which bolstered their economic and social power, if not their political power, into the 1960s and 1970s. This is at least part of the story of black resistance to Jim Crow and the beginnings of political and economic, if not cultural, manifestations of the new Negro. With this, I'll end the lecture. As always, thanks for your attention.